Welcome to I Could Talk to You All Day. I'm Lauren Lefkowitz, recovering workaholic, perfectionist, and people pleaser.
And I'm John Spears, emerging from playing small, getting caught up in the inertia of life, and always being on.
I Could Talk to You All Day is a show for executives and emerging leaders. This is not just another leadership podcast. We're here to talk about what it means to be a leader while also being human.
So join us for raw, vulnerable, and probably pretty funny conversations about shifting from surviving at work and home to thriving in the life you've always wanted. Let's get the conversation started. Hey, Lauren.
Hey, John.
How are you doing?
John, I'm really excited about what we're talking about today.
I am also super excited about what we're talking about today. And for our community, we're talking about this new phenomena that we've been hearing a lot about on social media and in the news, which is quiet quitting. Lots of conversation around this at work and in our friend groups, and like I said, on social media, and really looking forward to diving into this topic with you and discussing what it means, first of all, because there's so much kind of swirl and churn around the term, what it means, what we do as both leaders and folks who work in organizations to really find balance and to create a thriving work life for us that works for us and also allows us to have the impact in the world that we want. Let me kick it over to you. You've worked in HR as a leader, but also in other parts of companies and organizations, and are really familiar with kind of this idea. It's a new term for a concept that might have been around for a really long time. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what quiet quitting is and some distinctions within the term.
Thanks, John. We're seeing this new term in all over the media, as you said, and it's not a new concept, but nobody's actually quite figured out what it means yet. There are two major definitions of quiet quitting that we're seeing. One is the person who has just given up. They've got something vibrating on their mouse, so they never look like they're offline. They take breaks all day. They're doing laundry as an escape, not as a necessity, because it's nice that they work from home. They are booking meetings, I say in quotes, that are friend time and family time in the middle of their workday. They are actively disengaged. And active disengagement is not a new term. It's not a new way of being. It's quitting your job and collecting the paycheck until somebody discovers you're not really doing the work. It happens for all kinds of reasons. Sure, it happens because sometimes people just don't want to work and it seems easy to collect a paycheck. More often, it happens from burnout. It happens from toxic workplaces. It happens from just putting so much pressure on yourself. It happens from being afraid to ask for more work or different work. So there are a lot of reasons why active disengagement and that definition of quiet quitting comes up. The other definition, which is making me furious and other people furious, is this sentiment that quiet quitting is doing, quote, only your job. And doing only your job is meaning leaving at 5 p.m., not taking evening calls, not coming in on the weekend because that's your quiet time to work, setting boundaries on the number of meetings that you'll take in a day or the amount of work that you'll take on your plate. That's actually just really healthy boundary setting. And in corporate America, we have not been good at that for a lot of years. The really damaging thing about calling boundary setting quiet quitting is that we already live as leaders, as emerging leaders, as executives, we already live in a world where so many of us think we're not doing enough, think we're not being enough, we're not showing up enough. We have to do more. And we look over to our neighbor, we look over to our colleague, and they seem to be doing more, and we want to do more than more so that we're really contributing and earning our keep. And so we've lost this boundary life, this healthy boundary life, where we got to decide when the workday ended. Everything has blended together. And now that people are realizing, oh, I have this opportunity to set healthy boundaries, they're being called quitters. And that is really damaging.
Lauren, I'm so glad that you made that distinction between this active disengagement sentiment that's been around for a really long time. And that's both, I think, unhealthy for individuals, but also companies and workplaces, and the distinction between what it means to actually set boundaries in a way that helps support us to live healthy, thriving lives, both at work and at home. And the fact that this is really about setting boundaries is really illuminating, because just like you, when I heard this idea of quiet quitting, I had this really, instinctual gut reaction to it, where quitting in my mind has a negative connotation. And it's tied to setting boundaries, which I think is one of the most healthy things that we can do as humans, both at work, but in our personal lives and every aspect of our lives. Creating boundaries is so healthy for us. And saying no is actually healthy for us. So many of us have a hard time saying no, have a hard time feeling like we're letting people down. But this idea of setting a boundary, I think, is so key. And I know for me, the last 2 years of the pandemic has really helped me clarify what's important to me and how I want to spend my time, and the importance of family for me, the importance of me taking care of myself and being healthy. And I realize I can't do all those things if I'm just saying yes to things at work. If I'm, to your point, working all the time on the weekends, on email after work, and not creating those healthy boundaries. And of course, things come up. There might be kind of seasons of busyness at work, or there's a sort of a fire drill that you have to take care of at night on the weekends. But that's not what we're really talking about here. We're really talking about setting boundaries from an unhealthy way of working, which is way above expectation, saying yes all the time, and not prioritizing our own health and what really works for us in the workplace.
John, I love what you said about boundaries and about saying no, and how those things are healthy. They are important, and they provide us balance and choice. And it's not about fitting everything in, right? Work, I think, for a long time, especially for boomers, Gen X, the elder Gen Ys, has been, I will do everything. I can have it all. We have made it work. And whether that has made us workaholics, whether that has made us, people who try to be and do everything for everyone all the time, we are burned out on it. As generations, we are burned out on it. And so to have this pandemic and all of the other events of the last 5 or 6 years just smack us right in the face and force us to look. And as a society, we've started gaining agreement that boundaries are needed, that saying no is needed, that finding balance, not finding a way to fit it all in, but finding balance is needed. And we've started empowering ourselves to do it. In comes the media with its really exciting, inciting statements, right? Naming quiet quitting. Now, did the media name it? Probably not. There's probably some dude who came up with it who was angry about his employees or her employees or their employees not doing things the way things used to be done. And it has taken off. And the media's job is to create conversation. So the fact that they're talking about quiet quitting as a topic is actually really interesting. The fact that they're talking about it with different definitions and nobody's really gotten what exactly we mean is confusing. And that second definition of you already think you're not good enough. You already live with imposter syndrome. You're already trying so hard to prove yourself over and over, and it's not enough. That's what quiet quitting is telling us, that it's not enough. And I can't disagree with it more. And I'm glad that, we're getting together and talking about this topic, because I think it's important to have the real conversation about it, and the real conversation about what is healthy boundary setting. How are you allowed to choose to live your life? How are you empowered to create the career that works for you, that serves yourself, serves the company, serves your team, serves the clients, and also allows you an entire life to live?
Yeah, I think, when you were just sharing that, Lauren, the one thing that I thought about is I was reflecting on my own life and the idea of boundaries. And I never had a good role model that taught me how to set boundaries in my family, in the workplace, certainly not growing up in work in the early 2000s, of the sort of being in DC, this idea that you need to get there early, stay late, this idea of working longer, that people really wanted more face time with you. They wanted to see you in the office. And so there was a whole host of people, my first job out of college, that would work until 8, 9 o'clock. And it was like a thing that we did. And we felt like we were sort of, cutting our teeth and learning how to work. But all through growing up in my career, up until recently, this idea of me setting boundaries, one, I didn't know how to do it. Two, I had really intense imposter syndrome. I was a people pleaser. I wanted to be successful. And I felt like the only thing that I could do was always go above and beyond, always say yes to something, always answer an email on the weekend or at nights when I got it. And I think for me, I didn't begin to make those shifts until I had active conversations about boundaries and about saying no. And so for so long in my career, I just didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to do it effectively. I didn't actually realize that looking out for myself and my own well-being actually impacts so many other things in a positive way, that when I'm healthy and alert and I'm getting enough sleep and I'm saying no, and I have enough time for my friends and my family and to work out and to go for a hike on the weekend, then I'm actually more present and more clear-minded and more effective in my work. And I just think that's super interesting, because even in leadership, I've never heard people talk about, in leadership courses or books, or when I took stuff in college, no one talked about boundaries there.
And no one talked about wellness. No one talked about balance. No one
Yeah.
talked about choice, right? I remember earlier in my career, there was an HR tool that I used for competencies, determining competencies for a job. There were 60 something competencies. And a couple of the competencies were work-life balance, humor, joy, things that you don't necessarily think of in the office. And we laughed at those. We were like, who's going to choose work-life balance as a competency? And this was probably 10 or so years ago, right? Because we were trained that work is work. Work comes first. Everything else is secondary. Your balance is like whatever time you have outside of the office. So I think the lessons that we have learned need to be unlearned.
Mm-hmm.
And this permission we've been looking for, that you sort of alluded to when you were just talking, this permission to go home early or say no or set a boundary, comes from us, comes from ourselves. It comes from us taking a stand for ourselves, empowering ourselves, and deciding how we are willing and able to work. And like you said before, that doesn't mean if it's the height of board meeting season and or there's a big event or there's a fire drill or something is urgent, it doesn't mean you're never going to work crazy hours. Doesn't mean you're never going to put in extra or go sort of above and beyond the job description. But it does mean that when that spike up comes down, it's not just, oh, we spiked up and now this is your new level of performance.
Right.
Anything you do next has to be above this level of performance. You've got to go with these ebbs and flows, and you have to decide as an individual what you are willing to give. And setting new boundaries and saying no in new ways is not quitting. And if there's anything that people walk away with hearing us talk about this, I want it to be that. You are not quitting. because you're setting boundaries. You are not quitting because you're saying no. It is not quitting to have plans after work that you don't imagine you're just going to cancel. It is not quitting to want to have time with your family or your friends or your hobbies or your dog or your cat. You are allowed to find the balance that you want to find. And that's why I keep coming back to it. This term quiet quitting is so damaging because it's telling us all the stuff we've been tentatively trying to learn and just starting to execute is wrong. We're going to look bad.
Yeah. And I think that this is such a timely discussion now because over the last 2 years, this is not true across the board, but I think many of us who have been working in an office setting have had more flexibility, have had more freedom in terms of how we run our days. We've been working from home. Things are different. Organizations are now calling people back into the office. They're having more of a structured re-entry into going back into the office and what it means to be back into the office. And I think this is a real good opportunity for leaders and employees to begin to kind of exercise this muscle around boundaries, because it's been fairly easy. I'm not saying it hasn't been easy at all in the past 2 years, but I think from a flexibility perspective, a lot of people have enjoyed more flexibility and freedom in terms of their jobs, and work and life have become more integrated. I know for me, my workstation is in the middle of my living room. So there's a lot of integration there when my kids are home or they're playing video games while I'm doing work, or, my computer's up and I see an email. Maybe I answer it at 9 or 10 at night, but it means I have more flexibility and freedom during the day to do other things. But I think this is a great opportunity for us to really think about what it is we want and need and begin to communicate that to our teams, our leaders, our managers, et cetera, to get really clear on having that aligned life. And so exercising that muscle now, I think, is really, really important.
I also want to go back to something you said earlier about productivity and the number of hours that we work. And I know we're not a studies have shown show, but studies have shown that if you work fewer hours, you actually become more productive. There's an upper limit. And because we're not a show that talks about studies have shown, I don't know what that is, but there is an upper limit to the number of hours that you work where there's a tipping point and you're no longer productive. You're just working all the time. And so being able to actually set these boundaries is healthier for the company.
Exactly. And I would say, even though this isn't a studies have shown show, I can talk about my experience. And I'm sure the people who are listening to this conversation right now have periods of their work life where they've had increased amount of stress, where they've had a longer than normal season of increased hours or stress. And I know for me, I can look back at that time of my life and remember what it feels like to be burnout, to have foggy brain, to feel disengaged, to not be at my A game. And seasons when things were pretty busy, but I was able to create boundaries and I was more effective. I was making better decisions. I was more strategic. I was more creative. And so again, we are not a studies have shown show, but I think if we all look at our experiences, I think we'll all see that when we have boundaries and when we're whatever that upper limit, it's probably different for different people. But if we're working 80 to 100 hours a week, that's taxing, and we are not robots. We can't just go. And even robots need maintenance and fuel and repair. And so to really think about that, like, what is best for me? In what areas do I operate? And sometimes there may not be alignment with where we are and what we want and need and where a company is. And that is okay to say, you know what? I'm looking for something different. That's not quitting. That's finding a better fit, better alignment in an organization or in a workplace that's really going to support who we are and how we work, given the new realities of a lot of our lives. Setting boundaries, at least in my mind in the past, I always felt like I was just, that I would be perceived to be someone who's just trying to do just enough to get by, just to get the C, to get like a satisfactory on my review. I just don't think that's true, though. I think that majority of people in the workforce want to do a good job. They want to advance the company's mission. I know in my organization, people are incredibly mission driven and want to have a positive impact. They also just want to go fishing on the weekends. They want to spend time with their families at night. They might need to take, a hike after work or spend time with their dog or their new family. And so those two things aren't mutually exclusive. You can both be incredibly effective at work and have the things you want to have at home and outside of work. You just have to be really clear about what you're willing to do and make sure that that's in alignment with the place you work.
I think with every generation, there is an age or a stage that some leadership gets to where they will say out loud, nobody wants to work anymore. And I think that's what's happening with this quiet quitting narrative. And I also think what you said is correct. It's not that nobody wants to work anymore. It's that we've realized and we recognize that the way that we've been working for all of these years is killing us. I can remember in my workaholic days going out to dinner with some friends and not having a drink because I was going to go home and open my laptop again, or being late, or just like sliding in at the last second to my seat because I was finishing something up at work, or completely canceling. Or even just being there, being at dinner, but not being present because I was thinking about the meeting I left early, or the work I was going to do when I got home, or what was on my plate for the next day, or what I was missing right then and there while I was at dinner that there would be repercussions for. And we as a society have lived like that for many years. I'm not unique. My story is not any different than a lot of other people. And what we're realizing now is that it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
I can decide to be present at dinner. I can decide to go to Sunday brunch and have a mimosa because I've decided not to work on Sunday. With this new narrative about quiet quitting being an implication that we're doing bare minimum work, my fear is that the high achiever, the person with imposter syndrome, the leader who just saw their colleague get promoted and it doesn't seem quite right or quite fair, is going to go back to this doubling down, to this working even harder because they don't want to be labeled as a quiet quitter. Just like people who change jobs every 2 or 3 years don't want to be labeled as job hoppers. You don't want a label that's going to make it seem like you're not in.
We've talked a little bit, or a lot rather, about the sort of going above and beyond, how it impacts us outside of work and working longer hours or doing email at night or over the weekend. But I also think this really applies to how we operate within an organization. And I'll give you an example of what it means for me. I have, over the last few years, have really worked hard at creating boundaries in my life across the board, not just at work, but in my personal life, with friends, with family, and relationships. And one of the things that I realized that my work schedule, the way that my day was set up with meetings and the timing of certain meetings, wasn't working for me anymore. I was working through lunch. I would have to steal 5 minutes at the end or a start of a meeting to run to the kitchen and grab a handful of my kids' goldfish and just scarf them down for lunch and hop back in the seat, or excuse myself during a meeting to use the bathroom. And I realized I just didn't want to work like that. I didn't want to live like that. I wasn't having fun. It wasn't serving me. I wasn't my best self. And so I worked really hard to set some parameters around how many breaks I needed during the day, how many actual work blocks I needed to be able to do the work that I needed to get done, as opposed to having meetings all day and then actually doing work at the end of the day, or, my need to have lunch, gosh, that's important. We need to be sustained. And so I think it's also really important. And I had a very hard time doing that. I felt like I would be judged by my colleagues. I felt like in many ways I wasn't as kind of resilient as my colleagues because they were not having a hard time going all the day. Hint, they probably are. No one, again, is a robot. And so I think it's really important for us to think about and to be really intentional about how we structure our days so that they're actually serving us and we're able to show up the way we want to show up in a way that actually is the fullest expression of ourselves.
First of all, goldfish are delicious.
They are so
but
good.
They shouldn't be your only choice for lunch.
Agreed.
Did anybody accuse you of quiet quitting when you made all of these changes?
No, actually, I've had a ton of people throughout my work thank me for doing that, and it's empowered them to be able to do that. And I think it's a good example for leaders and organizations to be able to lead in that way. And as I said earlier, I just don't think a lot of folks have mentors around setting boundaries. And I think as leaders, it's our responsibility to be able to set those boundaries and to live like that.
I totally agree. I remember when I started setting boundaries, I started really small. Nothing bad happened. Nobody accused me of not working hard. Nobody accused me of quiet quitting. That empowered me to do more. So like you're setting the example now for your team, and you're probably not accomplishing any less. In fact, you're probably accomplishing more because you're organized in a different way.
100%.
And then you get to live your whole life. It's not just about work. And as we're talking about this, we haven't really mentioned the employer, right? And they do have some responsibility. There is a culture setting at the top and all of that kind of stuff. But I think the reason that we're not talking about that, and the reason that I don't even think we need to, is because so much of this boundary setting, permission and dialogue and choice, it comes from us as individuals. It comes from us as individuals, as direct leaders to a next level of people, as how we manage up to our own bosses. It's so much less about the actual company than it is about you and how you want to function in your life. If you are thinking about boundaries and thinking it's going to make you look like a quiet quitter, get that out of your head. Don't believe that narrative.
100%. So we're coming up to the end of our conversation, and I'd love to talk about advice or some thoughts for employers and employees. And you mentioned for employees, start small. I love that advice. Any other advice or thoughts you have for folks in organizations or anywhere really around beginning to create boundaries in their lives?
What you just said about the 0 to 60 is so important. It's like going to the gym when you haven't been to the gym for years, right? You go, you get on the elliptical, you're like, oh, it's actually pretty easy and there's no impact. I'm going to be on this for an hour. And while I'm here, maybe I'll lift some weights and then you wake up the next morning and everything hurts. And then you wake up the second morning and your legs don't work.
Yeah. It's always harder the second day.
It is always harder the second day. And then you give up because that is painful and it is hard and horrible. So just like with building any muscle, to build your boundary muscle, to build your balance muscle is a test of time. It's repetition. It's a little bit at a time. You're building a muscle. You build it slowly. And remember that you're not by yourself. Whether you hire a coach, whether you find a mentor, whether you have a buddy that you're holding each other accountable to setting boundaries and celebrating when you set boundaries together, find a way to have some support. As the president and CEO, as a vice president, as a senior vice president, set the example that you go to your kids' t-ball game. You're not checking in the whole time you're at the t-ball game. Set the example that you're taking the afternoon to go to the spa. As the employer, set the example. And you win too, because you're also an employee.
The other thing that I would add, and I think this is so important, particularly now in the kind of environment that we're in globally, is to take care of your people. I had an incredible boss. His name is Ambassador Al Lenhart. He had these maxims that he would share all the time throughout the day. And he would always say, take care of people and they'll take care of everything else. And so in addition to being mindful about what's on everyone's plate, I think having a genuine interest in people on your team and in your organization, really caring for people goes such a long way and can really help with engagement and with modeling boundaries and other kinds of behavior. I could talk to you all day about
I could talk to you all day.
I know I have like so many more things I want to talk about, but our time is up, unfortunately. Thanks for this conversation, and thanks to all of our listeners in our community. We would love to hear from you. Please send us topics, feedback, what's working, what's not working. We're really interested in hearing what this community has to say. We've already heard so many great pieces of feedback in terms of the intent of what we're trying to create with this podcast. And so feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. I hope you'll join us again for our next episode, and see you soon.
We're so grateful you decided to be with us during this episode. Subscribe, rate, and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues, and join us next time for more Real Talk.